When most people think of the Pacific War, they picture massive carrier battles, kamikaze attacks, and the relentless island-hopping campaign that brought the United States Navy to the doorstep of Japan. But beneath the surface of these epic clashes was a technological race, a race that would decide not just who won the war, but how modern naval warfare would be fought for generations to come. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was, by almost every measure, one of the most formidable fighting forces on the planet. Its ships were fast, its crews were superbly trained, and its officers were masters of gunnery and tactics. The Japanese had invested heavily in optical rangefinders, night fighting skills, and the art of the long-range torpedo attack. Their battleships and cruisers bristled with powerful guns, and their aircraft carriers had already proven their worth at Pearl Harbor and in the early months of the war. The United States Navy, by contrast, was still finding its footing. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a shock, and the loss of so many battleships forced the Americans to rethink their entire approach to naval warfare. But the U.S. Navy had something the Japanese did not: a vast industrial base, a culture of innovation, and a willingness to embrace new technology, even if it meant breaking with tradition. At the heart of this technological revolution was radar. In the early 1940s, radar was still a new and mysterious tool. The British had pioneered its use in the Battle of Britain, but the U.S. Navy was quick to see its potential at sea. Radar could see through darkness, fog, and smoke, giving ships the ability to detect enemies long before they were visible to the naked eye. It could guide gunfire with unprecedented accuracy, direct fighter planes to intercept incoming raids, and turn the chaos of night battles into a deadly game of electronic chess. The Japanese, for all their skill and courage, were slow to adopt radar. Their perfectionist engineering culture, combined with a fragmented research effort and a deep respect for traditional tactics, meant that Japan's Navy entered the war with some of the best-trained crews and sharpest optics in the world, but without the electronic eyes and brains that would soon define modern naval combat. The difference became clear in battle after battle. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, the U.S. battleship Washington used radar-directed gunfire to destroy the Japanese battleship Kirishima in just 7 minutes, without suffering a single hit in return. American gunners could track and target enemy ships in total darkness, while Japanese crews were left searching the night with binoculars and searchlights. But the story of how the U.S. Navy pulled ahead is more than just a tale of gadgets and gizmos. It's a story of people, of scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory, of engineers at Westinghouse and RCA, of sailors and officers who learned to trust the strange new screens and dials that would soon become as familiar as a compass or a sextant. It's a story of mass production, of thousands of radar sets rolling off assembly lines and being installed on every ship, from the mightiest battleship to the humblest destroyer escort. It's also a story of mistakes, setbacks, and hard lessons learned. Early radar sets were bulky, unreliable, and prone to breakdowns. Training sailors to use them was a challenge, and integrating radar data into the chaos of battle required new tactics, new procedures, and a new way of thinking about command and control. But the U.S. Navy was relentless. When a radar set failed, it was fixed or replaced. When a new model was developed, it was rushed to the fleet. When a tactic didn't work, it was revised and tried again. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy was falling further and further behind. Their engineers developed radar sets, but production was slow and deployment was limited. Many Japanese ships went to their final battles with nothing more than optical rangefinders and the eyes of their lookouts. Even when radar was available, it was often seen as a backup to traditional methods, not as the primary tool for fighting and winning battles. The result was a growing gap, not just in technology, but in the very way the two navies fought. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had a 2-year lead in radar, fire control, and electronic warfare. American ships like the Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships were designed around integrated radar and combat information centers, enabling night operations, precise fire control, and air defense with unprecedented battlefield awareness. Japanese ships, for all their elegance and power, were fighting a war that no longer existed. This gap would only widen as the war went on. The U.S. Navy's approach to innovation was systematic and relentless. New radar systems like the Mark 8 and Mark 12 were developed, tested, and deployed across the fleet in record time. Combat information centers became the nerve centers of every ship, fusing radar, sonar, radio, and visual data into a single, coherent picture of the battle. American commanders could make decisions based on real-time information, while their Japanese counterparts were often left guessing. But the story of the technological race in the Pacific is not just about machines. It's about the men who used them, the sailors who learned to trust the blips on a screen, the officers who rewrote the rules of naval warfare, and the scientists and engineers who worked around the clock to give their country an edge. It's about courage, adaptability, and the willingness to embrace change, even when it meant leaving behind the traditions of the past. In the next section, we'll dive deeper into the radar revolution, how American scientists and engineers developed the systems that would change the face of naval warfare, and how the U.S. Navy learned to use them in battle. We'll see how the lessons of Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea shaped the future of the fleet, and how the Japanese Navy struggled to keep up in a world that was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The story of radar in World War II is one of the most dramatic examples of how technology can change the course of history. For the United States Navy, radar was more than just a new gadget. It was a revolution in the way wars were fought at sea. And it was a revolution that the Japanese Navy, for all its skill and tradition, simply could not match. Radar, short for radio detection and ranging, wasn't invented overnight. It was the result of years of research by scientists in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere. But it was in the United States, and especially at MIT's radiation laboratory, that radar became a weapon of war. The Rad Lab, as it was known, was a hive of activity, filled with young physicists, engineers, and mathematicians working around the clock to turn theory into reality. The U.S. Navy was quick to see the potential. Even before Pearl Harbor, American warships were being fitted with early radar sets. These first systems were crude by modern standards, bulky, unreliable, and with limited range. But they offered something no optical system could: the ability to see through darkness, fog, and smoke. For the first time, a ship could detect an enemy long before it was visible to the naked eye. As the war progressed, radar technology advanced at a breathtaking pace. The Mark III and Mark IV fire control radars gave American ships the ability to track enemy vessels and direct gunfire with unprecedented accuracy. The Mark VIII FC radar, introduced in 1942, was a game-changer. It could pinpoint a target's range and bearing, even in total darkness or bad weather. The Mark 12 and Mark 22 radars, developed soon after, added even more capability, allowing ships to track aircraft and surface targets simultaneously. But radar was more than just a tool for gunnery. It became the eyes and ears of the fleet. Surface search radars like the SG and SC sets could detect enemy ships and submarines at long range, giving American commanders a crucial edge in planning and executing attacks. Air search radars like the SK and SR sets could spot incoming raids, giving carriers and battleships time to launch fighters and prepare their defenses. The impact on naval tactics was immediate and profound. Before radar, night battles were a terrifying gamble. Ships relied on lookouts, searchlights, and optical rangefinders, tools that were useless in fog, rain, or the chaos of combat. The Japanese Navy, with its superb night-fighting skills and deadly long-lance torpedoes, had dominated the early battles of the Pacific. But with radar, the U.S. Navy could turn the tables. The Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 was the turning point. In a series of brutal night actions, American ships equipped with radar were able to detect and engage Japanese forces before they could be seen. The most famous example came on the night of November 14, 15, when the battleship USS Washington used her Mark 8 radar to track and destroy the Japanese battleship Kirishima. In just 7 minutes, Washington scored dozens of hits, sinking Kirishima without suffering a single hit in return. It was a stunning demonstration of the power of radar-directed gunfire, and a sign of things to come. The Japanese, for their part, were slow to respond. Their engineers developed radar sets, but production was limited and deployment was slow. Many Japanese ships went into battle with nothing more than optical rangefinders and the eyes of their lookouts. Even when radar was available, it was often seen as a backup to traditional methods, not as the primary tool for fighting and winning battles. The result was a growing gap, not just in technology, but in the very way the two navies fought. The U.S. Navy's approach to innovation was systematic and relentless. New radar systems were developed, tested, and deployed across the fleet in record time. When a better model became available, it was rushed to the front lines. Crews were trained to use the new equipment, and tactics were revised to take full advantage of radar's capabilities. Combat Information Centers, CICs, became the nerve centers of every ship, fusing radar, sonar, radio, and visual data into a single, coherent picture of the battle. This integration of technology and tactics was a key reason for the U.S. Navy's success. Radar wasn't just a gadget, it was part of a system. American ships could fight at night, in bad weather, and at long range. They could coordinate attacks, avoid ambushes, and respond to threats with speed and precision. The Japanese, by contrast, were fighting a war that no longer existed, a war of optics, intuition, and tradition. The difference was stark. In battle after battle, American ships used radar to detect and engage Japanese forces before they could respond. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the famous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar-guided fighters and anti-aircraft guns decimated Japanese carrier aircraft, crippling the Imperial Navy's air arm. In the battles of Leyte Gulf and Surigao Strait, radar-directed gunfire allowed American battleships to destroy Japanese ships in total darkness, often before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The Japanese Navy's perfectionist engineering culture and fragmented research efforts only made things worse. While American industry embraced iterative improvement, fielding multiple specialized radar systems and upgrading them as new technology became available, the Japanese struggled to produce and deploy even basic sets. Their focus on perfecting each system before mass production meant that by the time a radar was ready, it was already obsolete. The result was a technological gap that grew wider with every month. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had a 2 to 3 year lead in radar, fire control, and electronic warfare. American ships like the Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships were designed around integrated radar and combat information centers, enabling night operations, precise fire control, and air defense with unprecedented battlefield awareness. Japanese ships, for all their elegance and power, were fighting a losing battle. But the radar revolution was about more than just machines. It was about people, about the scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory, the engineers at Westinghouse and RCA, the sailors and officers who learned to trust the strange new screens and dials. It was about a culture of innovation, a willingness to embrace change, and a relentless drive to stay ahead of the enemy. The story of radar in World War II is a story of courage, adaptability, and the power of technology to change the world. It's a story that continues to inspire, reminding us that the future belongs to those who are willing to innovate, to take risks, and to leave the past behind. In the next section, we'll see how the radar revolution played out in the heat of battle, how American ships used their new electronic eyes to win decisive victories, and how the Japanese Navy struggled to adapt to a world that was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Pacific War was no longer just a contest of ships and sailors. It was a contest of who could see first, shoot first, and coordinate best. Radar, once a mysterious new technology, was now at the heart of the U.S. Navy's strategy. The Japanese Navy, for all its tradition and skill, was about to learn just how much the rules of naval warfare had changed. The best place to see this transformation was in the night battles that raged across the Solomon Islands and the Central Pacific. Before radar, night fighting was a terrifying gamble. Ships relied on lookouts, searchlights, and optical rangefinders. The Japanese Navy excelled at this kind of combat. Their crews were trained to fight in darkness. Their torpedoes were the deadliest in the world, and their tactics were honed by years of practice. In the early battles, like Savo Island and Tassafaronga, the Japanese inflicted heavy losses on the U.S. Navy, often slipping away before the Americans even knew what hit them. But as radar-equipped ships arrived in the Pacific, the balance began to shift. The U.S. Navy's new destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were fitted with SG surface search radar and Mark 8 fire control radar. These systems could detect enemy ships at ranges of 10, 15, even 20 miles, far beyond the reach of the best Japanese optics. For the first time, American commanders could track enemy movements in real time, coordinate their own ships, and open fire with deadly accuracy in total darkness. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 was the turning point. On the night of November 14, 15, the battleship USS Washington, under the command of Admiral Willis Lee, used her Mark 8 radar to track and engage the Japanese battleship Kirishima. In a matter of minutes, Washington scored dozens of hits, setting Kirishima ablaze and sending her to the bottom. The Japanese, relying on searchlights and visual spotting, never landed a single hit on Washington. It was a stunning demonstration of the power of radar-directed gunfire and a sign that the days of optical range-finding were over. After Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy doubled down on radar. Every new ship was equipped with the latest systems, and older ships were retrofitted as quickly as possible. Crews were trained to use radar not just for gunnery, but for navigation, air defense, and even search and rescue. Combat Information Centers, CICs, became the nerve centers of every ship, where officers and enlisted men worked together to interpret radar data, plot enemy movements, and direct the ship's weapons and maneuvers. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to catch up. Their engineers developed radar sets, but production was slow and deployment was limited. Many Japanese ships went into battle with nothing more than optical rangefinders and the eyes of their lookouts. Even when radar was available, it was often seen as a backup to traditional methods, not as the primary tool for fighting and winning battles. The result was a growing gap, not just in technology, but in the very way the two navies fought. The difference was stark in battle after battle. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carriers used radar to detect incoming Japanese air raids, vector fighters to intercept them, and direct anti-aircraft fire with deadly precision. The result was the near-total destruction of Japan's carrier air arm. In the battles of Leyte Gulf and Surigao Strait, radar-directed gunfire allowed American battleships and cruisers to ambush Japanese forces at night, often before the enemy even knew they were under attack. For American sailors, radar became a trusted ally. Stories spread of ships that avoided torpedoes, found their way through storms, or rescued downed pilots thanks to the magic of radar. Commanders learned to trust the blips on the screen, even when their instincts told them otherwise. The ability to see in the dark gave the U.S. Navy a confidence and flexibility that the Japanese could not match. But radar was not a silver bullet. There were still challenges: false echoes, equipment failures, and the need for constant training. Some commanders were slow to trust the new technology, and there were moments when radar data was misinterpreted or ignored. But the overall trend was clear. The U.S. Navy was learning, adapting, and getting better with every battle. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, was falling further behind. Their perfectionist engineering culture and fragmented research efforts meant that even when radar was available, it was often outdated or poorly integrated. Japanese ships lacked the kind of centralized combat information centers that became standard on American vessels. Communication between ships was often slow or unreliable, and the lack of real-time data made it difficult to coordinate complex maneuvers or respond to changing threats. The impact on morale was profound. American crews began to feel that they had an edge, not just in numbers or firepower, but in the very way they fought. Japanese crews, once the masters of night fighting, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. The psychological advantage shifted, and with it, the momentum of the war. The radar revolution also changed the way battles were planned and fought. American commanders could now launch night attacks, coordinate carrier strikes, and defend against kamikaze raids with a level of precision that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The ability to integrate radar, radio, and fire control systems into a single, coherent picture of the battle gave the U.S. Navy a level of situational awareness that was unmatched by any other fleet in the world. By mid-1943, the technological gap was undeniable. American ships like the Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships were designed around integrated radar and combat information centers, enabling night operations, precise fire control, and air defense with unprecedented battlefield awareness. Japanese ships, for all their elegance and power, were fighting a losing battle. The story of radar in the Pacific War is a story of innovation, adaptation, and the relentless drive to stay ahead of the enemy. It's a story that continues to inspire, reminding us that the future belongs to those who are willing to embrace change, take risks, and leave the past behind. In the next section, we'll explore how the U.S. Navy's systematic approach to innovation, powered by American industry, research labs, and a culture of continuous improvement, left Japan years behind. We'll see how the integration of radar, fire control, and information systems became the blueprint for modern naval warfare, and how the lessons of World War II still shape the fleets of today. By 1943, the Pacific War was no longer just a contest of ships and sailors. It was a contest of systems. The United States Navy's technological edge was no accident. It was the result of a deliberate, systematic approach to innovation that harnessed the full power of American industry, science, and organization. This was the real secret behind the U.S. Navy's 2-year lead over Japan. Not just inventing new gadgets, but building a machine for continuous improvement, mass production, and rapid deployment. The heart of this machine was the partnership between the military, universities, and private industry. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, known as the RAD Lab, was the nerve center of radar development. Here, some of the brightest minds in America worked around the clock, turning theoretical physics into practical tools for war. The RAD Lab didn't just invent radar. It created a pipeline for moving new ideas from the lab bench to the battlefield in record time. When a new radar system was developed, it didn't sit on a shelf waiting for perfection. Prototypes were rushed to the fleet, tested in real combat, and improved based on feedback from sailors and officers. If a radar set failed, it was fixed or replaced. If a better model was available, it was installed as soon as possible. This iterative, good enough for now, better tomorrow approach was the opposite of the Japanese method, which prized perfection and thorough testing before deployment. The result was that American ships were always fighting with the latest technology, while Japanese ships often went into battle with outdated or incomplete systems. American industry was the engine that made this possible. Companies like Westinghouse, RCA, and General Electric turned out thousands of radar sets, fire control computers, and electronic components. Shipyards worked around the clock, building new carriers, battleships, and destroyers designed from the keel up to integrate radar, sonar, and advanced communications. The Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships were not just bigger and better armed, they were smarter, with combat information centers, CICs, that fused data from every sensor and weapon into a single real-time picture of the battle. This integration was revolutionary. In the CIC, officers could see radar plots, track enemy ships and planes, direct gunfire, and coordinate with other ships and aircraft, all at once. Decisions that once took minutes or hours could now be made in seconds. The U.S. Navy became a networked force, able to fight at night, in bad weather, and across vast distances. The Japanese, by contrast, still relied on visual spotting, flag signals, and voice tubes. Their ships were powerful, but they fought as individuals, not as a coordinated system. The impact on the battlefield was dramatic. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carriers used radar to detect incoming Japanese air raids, vector fighters to intercept them, and direct anti-aircraft fire with deadly precision. The result was the near-total destruction of Japan's carrier air arm. In the battles of Leyte Gulf and Surigao Strait, radar-directed gunfire allowed American battleships and cruisers to ambush Japanese forces at night, often before the enemy even knew they were under attack. Japan's approach to technology was very different. Japanese engineers were brilliant, and their optical rangefinders and torpedoes were among the best in the world. But their research efforts were fragmented, with different branches of the military and industry working in isolation. There was little coordination, and new inventions often got bogged down in bureaucracy or perfectionist testing. When Japan did develop radar, it was usually deployed in small numbers, as a supplement to traditional methods rather than a replacement. This cultural difference was crucial. The U.S. Navy's willingness to accept good enough and improve on the fly meant that American ships were always getting better, always learning, always adapting. The Japanese, by contrast, were often fighting the last war, relying on skills and tactics that had worked in the past, but were now obsolete. The U.S. Navy's system of mass production and rapid deployment also meant that new technology reached the fleet quickly and in large numbers. By mid-1943, almost every American warship had at least one radar set, and many had several. Specialized radars were developed for surface search, air search, fire control, and navigation. The Mark 8 and Mark 12 radars, for example, gave American ships the ability to track and engage targets at long range, even in total darkness or bad weather. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to keep up. Their first shipboard radar, the Type 21, was introduced in 1942, but it was bulky, unreliable, and limited in range. Later models improved on the design, but production was slow and deployment was limited. Many Japanese ships went into their final battles with nothing more than optical rangefinders and the eyes of their lookouts. The difference in approach was also evident in training and doctrine. The U.S. Navy invested heavily in training sailors and officers to use radar and electronic systems. Radar operators became a new breed of specialist, and CIC officers were trained to interpret data, make decisions, and coordinate with other ships and aircraft. Exercises and war games were used to develop new tactics and procedures, and lessons learned in combat were quickly shared across the fleet. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, was slow to adapt. Many officers distrusted radar, preferring the skills they had honed over years of training. Radar was often seen as a backup, not a primary tool. There was little emphasis on integrating radar data into command decisions, and few ships had the kind of centralized information centers that became standard in the U.S. Navy. The result was a growing gap, not just in technology, but in the very way the two navies fought. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was operating as a true networked force, with ships, planes, and submarines all sharing information and coordinating their actions. The Japanese, for all their courage and skill, were fighting a war that no longer existed. This systematic approach to innovation and integration was the real reason the U.S. Navy pulled so far ahead. It wasn't just about having better gadgets. It was about building a system that could learn, adapt, and improve faster than the enemy. It was about harnessing the full power of American industry, science, and organization to create a fleet that was always one step ahead. The lessons of this approach are still relevant today. In any field, military, business, or technology, the ability to innovate, integrate, and adapt is the key to staying ahead. The story of the U.S. Navy's radar revolution is a reminder that success is not just about having the best ideas, but about turning those ideas into reality, getting them into the hands of the people who need them, and being willing to change course when the world changes around you. In the next section, we'll see how this technological and organizational edge played out in the final years of the war. We'll look at the new generation of American warships, like the Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships, designed from the ground up to take advantage of radar and electronic warfare. And we'll see how the U.S. Navy's dominance in technology and integration helped seal the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By 1943, the U.S. Navy's technological and organizational edge was being built into the very bones of its newest warships. The Essex-class aircraft carriers and Iowa-class battleships weren't just bigger and better armed. They were designed from the keel up to take full advantage of radar, advanced fire control, and integrated combat information centers. These ships would become the backbone of the U.S. fleet, and their design would set the standard for navies around the world for decades to come. Let's start with the Essex-class carriers. When the first Essex, USS Essex, CV-9, was commissioned in December 1942, she represented a new era in naval warfare. The Essex-class was designed for mass production, with modular construction that allowed multiple ships to be built simultaneously in different shipyards. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers had been launched, more than any other fleet carrier class in history. But it wasn't just about numbers. The Essex-class was a floating airbase, capable of launching, recovering, and maintaining dozens of aircraft at a time. Her flight deck was longer and wider than previous carriers, allowing for larger air groups and more efficient operations. Below decks, the ship was a maze of workshops, hangars, and storage spaces, all designed to keep the planes flying and the bombs dropping. Most importantly, the Essex-class was built around radar and electronic warfare. Air search radars like the SK and SC sets could detect incoming raids at long range, giving the carrier time to launch fighters and prepare defenses. Surface search radars like the SG set could spot enemy ships and submarines, even in darkness or bad weather. Fire control radars directed the ship's anti-aircraft guns with deadly accuracy, turning the carrier into a fortress against kamikaze attacks. The heart of the Essex-class's technological edge was the Combat Information Center, CIC. Here, officers and enlisted men worked together to interpret radar data, track enemy movements, and coordinate the ship's defenses. The CIC was the nerve center of the ship, fusing information from radar, sonar, radio, and visual sightings into a single real-time picture of the battle. Decisions that once took minutes or hours could now be made in seconds. The Iowa-class battleships were just as advanced. These were the last and greatest battleships ever built by the United States. Fast, heavily armed, and protected by thick armor, the Iowa-class ships were designed to keep up with the fast carrier task forces and provide heavy gunfire support. But like the Essex-class, their real strength was in their electronics. Each Iowa-class battleship was equipped with multiple radar sets for air and surface search, fire control, and navigation. The Mark 8 and Mark 13 fire control radars allowed the battleships to hit targets at ranges of 20 miles or more, even in total darkness. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries were directed by radar, making them deadly opponents for enemy planes. The CIC on an Iowa-class battleship was a marvel of organization, with officers tracking dozens of targets and coordinating with other ships and aircraft. The integration of radar and electronic warfare into the design of these ships was a game-changer. It allowed the U.S. Navy to fight at night, in bad weather, and across vast distances. It gave American commanders a level of situational awareness that was unmatched by any other fleet in the world. And it made the U.S. Navy's carrier task forces the most powerful striking force on the planet. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, was still fighting with ships designed for a different era. Their carriers and battleships were elegant, fast, and well-armed, but they lacked the integrated radar and information systems that gave the Americans their edge. Japanese ships relied on visual spotting, flag signals, and voice tubes. Their radar sets, when available, were often outdated or poorly integrated. The result was that Japanese commanders were often fighting blind, unable to coordinate their forces or respond to changing threats in real time. The difference was stark in battle after battle. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carriers used radar to detect incoming Japanese air raids, vector fighters to intercept them, and direct anti-aircraft fire with deadly precision. The result was the near-total destruction of Japan's carrier air arm. In the battles of Leyte Gulf and Surigao Strait, radar-directed gunfire allowed American battleships and cruisers to ambush Japanese forces at night, often before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The U.S. Navy AS technological edge was not just about having better gadgets. It was about having a system that could learn, adapt, and improve faster than the enemy. New radar systems were developed, tested, and deployed across the fleet in record time. Crews were trained to use the new equipment, and tactics were revised to take full advantage of radar's capabilities. Lessons learned in combat were quickly shared across the fleet, and new ideas were put into practice almost overnight. This culture of innovation and adaptation was the real secret to the U.S. Navy's success. It allowed the Americans to stay ahead of the Japanese, to exploit every advantage, and to turn the tide of the war. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was operating as a true networked force, with ships, planes, and submarines all sharing information and coordinating their actions. The Japanese, for all their courage and skill, were fighting a war that no longer existed. The impact of these new warships and their integrated systems went far beyond World War II. The Essex-class carriers and Iowa-class battleships set the standard for post-war naval design. The concept of the Combat Information Center became a fixture on every major warship. Radar, electronic warfare, and networked command and control became the foundation of modern naval power. For the men who served on these ships, the experience was transformative. They learned to trust the blips on the radar screen, to work as a team in the CIC, and to fight as part of a coordinated, high-tech force. The lessons they learned would shape the U.S. Navy for generations to come. In the next and final section, we'll reflect on the legacy of this technological revolution, how the U.S. Navy's 2-year lead in radar and integration changed the outcome of World War II, redefined naval warfare, and set the stage for the modern era. We'll also consider what this story teaches us about the power of innovation, the importance of adaptability, and the enduring value of learning from history. The end of World War II marked not just the defeat of the Axis powers, but the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The story of how the U.S. Navy pulled ahead of the Imperial Japanese Navy by 2 years or more in radar, fire control, and system integration became a blueprint for the future. The lessons learned in the Pacific would shape navies, militaries, and even civilian technology for generations to come. The most immediate legacy was clear. Technology, when combined with mass production and a culture of innovation, could outweigh even the best training, tactics, or tradition. The U.S. Navy ES radar advantage wasn't just about having a new gadget. It was about building a system that could see farther, react faster, and coordinate more effectively than any opponent. The Combat Information Center, born out of necessity, became the nerve center of every major warship, fusing radar, sonar, radio, and visual data into a single real-time picture of the battle. This new way of fighting changed everything. Night battles, once a terrifying gamble, became opportunities for the U.S. Navy to strike first and strike hard. Carrier task forces could launch coordinated air raids, defend against kamikaze attacks, and maneuver with confidence even in the dead of night or the thickest fog. Battleships and cruisers could deliver devastating broadsides with radar-directed accuracy, often before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The Japanese Navy, for all its courage and skill, was left behind. Their perfectionist approach to engineering, their fragmented research efforts, and their reliance on tradition meant that they were always playing catch-up. By the time they fielded effective radar systems, the war was already lost. Their ships, for all their elegance and power, were fighting a war that no longer existed. The impact of this technological revolution went far beyond the Pacific. The lessons of radar, system integration, and mass production became the foundation of the Cold War navies. The U.S. Navy's post-war carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were all designed around the principles learned in World War II: networked sensors, centralized command, and the ability to adapt quickly to new threats. The Soviet Navy, too, learned from these lessons, investing heavily in radar, electronic warfare, and missile technology. But the legacy of the U.S. Navy's 2-year lead wasn't just about ships and weapons. It was about people. The scientists at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, the engineers at Westinghouse and RCA, the sailors and officers who learned to trust the blips on a screen, all became part of a culture of innovation that would drive American technology for decades. The same spirit that built the radar systems of World War II would go on to create the computers, satellites, and networks that define the modern world. The story of the U.S. Navy's technological edge is also a story of humility and adaptability. The Americans didn't get everything right the first time. Early radar sets were bulky and unreliable. Training sailors to use them was a challenge. Integrating radar data into the chaos of battle required new tactics, new procedures, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. But the U.S. Navy was relentless. When something didn't work, it was fixed or replaced. When a better idea came along, it was adopted and improved. This culture of continuous improvement was the real secret weapon. It allowed the U.S. Navy to stay ahead of the Japanese, to exploit every advantage, and to turn the tide of the war. It's a lesson that still resonates today, in every field where technology and innovation matter. The war in the Pacific proved that courage, training, and tactical skill are vital, but they are not enough. In the end, it was the ability to innovate, to mass produce, and to integrate new systems that decided the fate of fleets and nations. The U.S. Navy's radar advantage was not just a technical achievement, it was a triumph of organization, vision, and the American spirit of, let's try it, let's fix it, let's make it better. For the sailors who served, the legacy was personal. Many would go on to careers in science, engineering, and industry, carrying with them the lessons of teamwork, adaptability, and the power of new ideas. The ships they served on: Essex-class carriers, Iowa-class battleships, Fletcher-class destroyers, became legends, not just for their firepower, but for their brains. Today, as we look back on the Pacific War, it's easy to focus on the big battles, the famous ships, and the heroic deeds. But the real story is in the details: the radar screens glowing in the dark, the CIC officers making split-second decisions, the engineers back home working through the night to get a new system to the fleet. It's a story of how technology, when harnessed by people with vision and determination, can change the world. The U.S. Navy's 2-year lead over Japan was not inevitable. It was earned through hard work, risk-taking, and a willingness to break with tradition. It's a lesson that still matters, whether you're building ships, running a business, or facing any challenge where the future is uncertain and the stakes are high. As you finish this documentary, think about what the story of radar, innovation, and the Pacific War means for you. Is it a lesson in the power of teamwork? A reminder that the best ideas are the ones that get used, not just invented? Or a call to keep learning, keep adapting, and never stop pushing forward? If you've enjoyed this journey through the real story of the US and Japanese navies in World War II, please like, comment, and subscribe for more untold WW2 stories and deep dives into the technology and people that shaped history. What do you think is the most important lesson from the Pacific War's technological race? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your take. Thank you for joining us on this voyage through history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep remembering the real stories behind the legends.